On the 11th day of February in the year 1890, the sky turned black at noon. Temperance Ashford was lying on the floor of a hollow tree, shaking so hard her teeth knocked together, her fingers too weak to hold the piece of firewood she needed to keep herself alive. The fever had been building for 2 days. Her lungs rattled with every breath. Outside the crude plank door Dean had built with her own hands, the wind was no longer blowing. It was screaming. The great sequoia around her had begun to sway, not the gentle rocking she had felt during the November storm, but something deeper. Something that moved through the roots and up through the floor and into her bones. She could not see beyond the door. She could not see 5 feet in any direction. The snow was not falling. It was being thrown. She did not know this was the worst blizzard in the recorded history of the Sierra Nevada. She did not know that buildings were collapsing across the foothills, that a man would die walking 100 yards through the white, that the railroad would be blocked for weeks. She knew only that the fire in the stove was dying and that she did not have the strength to reach the woodpile 6 feet away, and that she was completely alone. She had been 17 years old when all of this began. She had $4.30, no family and no shelter. That was 7 months ago. Go back to the beginning. It was July of 1889, and Temperance Ashford was scrubbing a pot in the back kitchen of a boarding house on Mill Street in Visalia, California, when the teamster appeared in the doorway. He was holding his hat in both hands, turning it slowly, the way men do when they are about to say something they do not want to say. He told her what her uncle had decided. Josiah Ashford had taken up with a widow in Three Rivers. He would not be sending wages anymore. He would not be coming back. He would not be providing for his dead sister's daughter, as he had promised when Temperance was 15 and had no one else left in the world. The teamster said he was sorry. He said he would not have wanted to be the one to deliver the message. Temperance set down the pot. Her hands were still wet. She wiped them on her apron. She did not speak. The words her uncle had sent were these: old enough to manage. Before the teamster had finished backing out of the doorway, Mrs. Farwell appeared behind him. She was the landlady, a woman of 50, with a thin mouth and eyes that were always calculating something. She did not wait for Temperance to ask what came next. 1 week, she said, then you go. Her voice was not cruel. It was simply final, the way a door closing in winter is not cruel, it is only cold. Temperance asked if she could stay on through the month in exchange for work. No wages, just the room and meals. Mrs. Farwell shook her head. She reached into her apron pocket and pressed a piece of hard bread into Temperance's wet hand. Then she turned and walked back into the house, and the door swung shut behind her. Temperance stood in the kitchen alone and counted her money. $4.30. She counted it 3 times as though the act of counting might change the result. It did not. She put the coins in the pocket of her dress and began to think. A room in Visalia cost $8 a month. She had 4. A cord of cut firewood cost $3. Winter would arrive in the Sierra foothills by late November. That gave her 4 months to find shelter. Gather 6 cords of firewood and store enough food to last until spring. 4 months, $4. No tools, no land, no skills, no one who owed her anything. The numbers produced no result that ended in survival. She left Visalia the next morning, walking east toward the mountains in the direction her uncle had gone. The foothills rose brown and dry in the July heat. 2 years of drought had cracked the earth and turned the grass to straw. Temperance walked 18 miles over 2 days, sleeping beside the road with her coat folded under her head and her hunger for company. She passed through Lemon Cove and Wood Lake without finding work. The men in those towns looked at her too long. The women looked away. In Wood Lake, she stopped at a laundry run by a woman named Martha Yunt, a stout and practical woman who at first seemed willing enough to take on extra help. She let Temperance wash and wring for a full morning without complaint. Then someone passed through and mentioned the name Ashford, and Martha Yunt's face changed the way weather changes all at once without apology. That family name carries nothing good in this county, she said. She counted out 15 cents for the morning's work, pressed them into Temperance's palm, and went back inside without looking up again. Temperance stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the laundry and understood something she had not fully understood before. It was not only that she had no money and no home, she was also carrying the reputation of a man she had never chosen, and every door she knocked on would open or close partly on the weight of that name before she ever spoke a word of her own. She reached Three Rivers on the 3rd day. It was barely a town, a scatter of wooden buildings along the Sequoia River, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a few dozen families scratching at the soil in the shadow of the Sierra Nevada. She asked at the store if anyone knew Josiah Ashford. They knew him. Everyone knew the new man living with the widow Harmon up the North Fork Road. Temperance did not go looking for him. She did not want to see his face or hear whatever excuse a man like that would have prepared for a moment like this. She asked instead if anyone needed help. Cooking, cleaning, anything at all. The storekeeper shook his head. The blacksmith's wife said she managed fine on her own. A woman with 3 small children looked at Temperance's soft hands and thin dress and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of answer. That was when Temperance saw Pemberton Talmadge. He was leaning against the porch rail of the general store, a man somewhere in his middle 50s, with a face that had been weathered by decades of sun and wind until it looked like something carved rather than born. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had seen every kind of trouble the mountains could produce and had made his peace with most of it. His family had ranched the Sequoia foothills since the 1860s. He had survived the Great Flood of 1862, when the rivers rose 30 feet and drowned cattle by the hundreds. He had survived the drought of 1877, when the wells went dry and the grass turned to white dust. He had buried 3 neighbors who believed they could manage a Sierra winter alone in the high country. He studied Temperance the way a man studies a horse he has already decided not to buy. "You are the Ashford girl," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir, Josiah's niece." Talmadge pushed himself off the railing and stood up straight. He told her plainly that her uncle owed money all across the county, that the name Ashford bought no goodwill here, and that she would not find work in 3 Rivers. When Temperance told him she would work for food alone, no wages, just a place to sleep and something to eat, he shook his head with the slow patience of a man explaining something to someone who could not yet understand what they were facing. "A girl alone cannot survive a foothill winter," he said. "Whatever shack you find will not hold heat. When the cold comes hard, it will come through the walls and the floor and the gaps around the door, and it will not stop until there is nothing left of you. Come spring, they will find your bones picked clean by bears." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a biscuit wrapped in cloth. He held it out to her. "Eat this," he said. "Walk back to Visalia and find the county poor farm. It is not a pleasant place, but you will live through the winter." He did not offer work. He did not offer shelter. He gave her a biscuit and a prediction of her death, and then he turned and walked away down the porch to attend to his own affairs. Temperance ate the biscuit, standing on the steps of the general store, watching the sun drop behind the western hills. She thought about the poor farm in Visalia, the overcrowded rooms, the gray-faced women with nowhere else to go. The smell she imagined would live in the walls of a place like that. She thought about the men she had passed on the road to 3 Rivers, the way their eyes had moved over her, and what those eyes had been considering. She thought about Martha Yunt counting out 15 cents and going back inside. The mathematics were simple and brutal. If she returned to Visalia, she traded one kind of danger for another, and in neither case would the danger be her own to manage. On the mountain, at least whatever came for her would be weather and cold and hunger. It would not have a face. She finished the biscuit, put the cloth in her pocket, and walked east. 2 days later, in the mountains east of Hammond, Temperance Ashford saw her first giant sequoia. Nothing she had encountered before, not in Missouri, not in the mining camps, and not in any of the lumber towns where she had drifted with her uncle, had prepared her for what stood in front of her. The trunks were 30 feet across. They rose so straight and so high that she had to crane her neck until it ached just to catch a glimpse of the canopy far above. The bark was the color of cinnamon, deep red and rough and furrowed. And when she put her hand against the nearest trunk, she could not feel the curve of it. The tree was so massive that its sides seemed flat like a wall that extended in both directions without end. She walked among them for an hour, tilting her head back, trying to make sense of the scale. These trees had been alive when the Romans were building their roads. They had stood here for 2,000 years, watching the mountains change around them. They would stand here long after every person Temperance had ever met was gone from the earth. Then she found the dead one. It stood apart from the others in a small clearing, killed by fire at some point in the distant past. The top had broken off somewhere above 100 feet, leaving a jagged black spire against the sky. The interior had been hollowed out by flames that consumed the heartwood while leaving the outer shell standing. Temperance walked around it slowly, studying it from every angle. The opening where the fire had burned through faced east, away from the direction the winter storms would come. The bark was still attached to the outer shell, still thick, still intact. She stepped inside. The charred wood was dry beneath her feet. The smell of old smoke was faint, more memory than presence. The walls curved around her like the inside of a cathedral, blackened by ancient fire, but solid. Light came through narrow gaps in the wood overhead, casting thin, pale lines across the floor. The space was roughly 8 feet wide at the base, narrowing slightly as it rose. The ceiling where the trunk continued upward was 12 feet above her head. She pressed her palm flat against the inner surface of the bark. It was soft, almost spongy. Not the softness of rot, but the softness of layered fiber. Hundreds of thousands of tiny strands compressed together with air held between them. She stood there for a long time with her hand pressed against that wall, and she thought about her mother. Her mother had made quilts in Missouri, heavy ones, the kind that could hold warmth through a January night when the fire had burned down to nothing. She had explained it to Temperance once, when Temperance was small enough to sit on the workbench and watch the needle move. "It is not the fabric that keeps you warm," she had said. "It is the air inside the batting. Air does not carry heat well. It holds it. The layers trap tiny pockets of air, and those pockets keep your body's warmth from escaping into the cold. A thin blanket cannot do this. A thick quilt can, because it has enough layers to hold enough air." Temperance pulled her hand away from the bark and looked at the 2 feet of layered fiber between herself and the outside world. 2 feet of those same pockets, 2 feet of trapped air wrapped around a hollow core that was already the size of a room. If this bark had kept fire out for decades, the same physics that governed fire governed cold. Heat moved from warm to cold, and it moved slowly through materials that did not conduct it well. If the bark could slow the movement of heat moving inward during a fire, it could slow the movement of heat moving outward during a blizzard. The tree was already insulation. The tree was already a wall. The fire had already made the room. She did not need to build shelter. She needed only to move into the shelter the forest had already made. She spent 3 days examining the sequoia from every angle before she committed to anything. She studied the roots, which spread outward from the base for 100 feet in every direction, still anchored deep in the earth. She studied the surviving wood above the fire scar, dry and solid. She looked at the living sequoias nearby, the ones that were still alive, and she saw on their bark the black scars of fires that had burned over the centuries without killing them. The bark had protected them every time. On the morning of the 4th day, Temperance Ashford began dragging salvaged planks across the clearing toward the dead tree. She had found them abandoned near a burned-out saw site left behind when the lumber camp shut down 2 years earlier. She had covered perhaps half the distance when a man stepped out of the tree line and told her to stop. Denton Dunstan was in his early 40s, a carpenter by trade, with hands so calloused they looked like they belonged to a much older man. He was a member of the Sequoia colony, a settlement of 300 people 3 miles up the mountain who had come to California to build a cooperative community where everything was shared and nothing was owned individually. They had been trying for 3 years to cut a road through the forest to the giant trees, believing they could log the sequoias to fund their experiment in collective living. Dunstan had been surveying that road when he spotted Temperance hauling timber through the underbrush. "Those boards belong to the mill," he said. "The mill has been closed for 2 years, Temperance answered. "Nobody is coming back for them." Dunstan walked closer, examining the planks, then examining Temperance with the same appraising squint. "What do you need them for?" she told him. She explained the hollow tree, the 2-foot bark, the fire-hollowed interior, the plan to build a door and install a small stove. She explained that she had approximately $1.70 and no one to assist her, and that winter was 8 weeks away. She did not apologize for any of it. Dunstan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite contempt. "A standing dead sequoia," he said. "You want to live inside a standing dead sequoia?" "Yes." He told her about the time he had watched one fall. No warning sound beforehand, no cracking, no leaning. Just a tree that had been standing for 1,000 years and was not standing anymore. And the ground shaking like an earthquake when 2,000 tons of wood hit the earth. He said it the way he would tell someone not to step onto thin ice, as a simple statement of observable fact. He also told her that even if the tree stayed up, no stove, she could afford would heat a space that large efficiently. She would burn through her firewood in weeks. Then he said something that surprised her. He said the Sequoia colony would take her in. They accepted people who had nowhere else to go. She would have shelter food community. She would not be alone. Temperance shook her head. Dunstan pressed the point. This was not about pride, he said. This was about survival. The mountains did not care about a person's independence. The cold did not make exceptions for people who preferred to manage alone. I am not going to live by someone else's rules, Temperance said. If I am going to survive this winter, I will survive it on my own terms, not as a charity case in someone else's experiment. Dunstan looked at her for another long moment. Then he stepped aside and let her pass with her planks. He did not take them back. He did not offer to help. He stood in the clearing and watched her until she disappeared into the trees, and whatever was working in him as he watched, he kept it to himself. The stove cost $2.50. Temperance found it in the back room of the Hammond General Store, a small sheet iron box with a 4-inch flue pipe and a door that did not quite close properly. The storekeeper wanted $3. Temperance offered $2. They settled on $2.50, and she handed over more than half of everything she had left in the world and carried the stove out of the store in pieces. She had planned to make the trip back to the Sequoia in stages, hashing pieces of the dismantled stove in a hollow log near the road and returning for each piece in turn. The plan worked for the first 3 components. The 4th piece, the heaviest section of the firebox, she hid carefully before walking back to Hammond for the night. In the morning, it was gone. She searched the area around the log for 20 minutes before accepting what had happened. Someone had found it and taken it, almost certainly believing it was abandoned scrap iron. She spent the better part of a day tracking it down, following a narrow logic of neighbors and farmsteads, until she found a man mending fence posts on a hillside property with a piece of her stove sitting in the grass beside his tools. He did not apologize when she explained. He simply handed it back and returned to his fence. She carried it up the mountain without saying another word. What that lost day cost her was not just time. It was the understanding that every single piece of this plan could come apart without warning through no fault of her own, through the ordinary carelessness of the world. There would be no stretches where things simply worked. Every step would require defending. She spent 3 weeks in September cleaning the interior of the hollow tree, scraping charred wood from the walls with a flat stone until she reached the pale, dry heartwood beneath. The work split her fingertips and turned her skin black with carbon dust. She coughed for a week straight, bent double at the entrance to the hollow, spitting dark into the dirt. The space that emerged was 8 feet wide at the floor and 12 feet high dry, even after 2 years of drought. Solid in every direction she pressed. She lined the floor with pine boughs gathered from fallen branches, layering them 2 feet deep. On top, she placed every scrap of cloth she could find, burlap sacks from the abandoned mill, a worn blanket traded for a day's kitchen work in Hammond, pieces of canvas too damaged to sell. The effect was rough but real. It was a bed, it was a floor, it was the inside of a home. The door took 4 days. Temperance had never built anything more complicated than a meal. She had no hammer, no nails, no saw. She had 8 planks, a knife her uncle had left behind, and strips of bark she peeled from fallen branches. She lashed the planks together by weaving bark strips through holes she carved with the knife, binding the door at top and middle and bottom. It was 4 feet tall and 2.5 feet wide, not large enough to fill the curved opening completely, but large enough to cover the center of it. She packed the gaps around the edges with a mixture of mud and pine pitch applied in layers. Mud first, then pitch to seal it, then more mud over the pitch. The stink of turpentine filled the clearing for days. She borrowed a hand drill from the blacksmith in Hammond by offering to clean his shop for a week. The drill was meant for hardwood, not for bark, and the fibrous layers clogged the bit every few rotations. 2 days to bore a 4-inch hole through 18 inches of Sequoia bark, angled slightly upward to prevent rain from pooling in the pipe. Her shoulders were so swollen by the end that she could not lift her arms above her head. The pipe went in, the stove went in, she sealed around the pipe with the same mud and pitch mixture. Then she built the first fire. She stood outside the tree for a full hour afterward, watching the bark around the pipe, watching the door seams, watching every place where heat and flame were meeting ancient wood. The bark did not catch, the mud held. Smoke rose from the pipe and spread into the evening air and disappeared. Temperance sat down in the dirt in front of the door and put her face in her hands. She had not cried since the morning she left Visalia. She cried now not from sorrow, but from something that had no better name than release the particular feeling of a person who has held their breath for months and been given at last permission to breathe. The tree was a cabin now, an unlikely one, a flawed one, a cabin made of fire-hollowed wood and salvaged iron and bark strip hinges and pine pitch. But a cabin, it was hers, it existed. She wiped her face and went inside to tend the fire. The threat arrived on a Tuesday in early October, while Temperance was stacking split wood against the base of the tree. She heard the boots before she heard the voice. Heavy steps, deliberate, the kind of steps a man makes when he wants to be heard approaching. She straightened up and turned to find Gilmore Merriweather standing at the edge of the clearing. He was in his mid-50s, heavy-set, with a face that had been rearranged by too many disagreements, settled with fists. He had been the foreman of the Smith Comstock mill operation before the company shut down 2 years earlier, and he had not quite accepted that his authority had shut down with it. He still walked this land as though the company's name gave him rights over everything on it. He looked at the Sequoia at the door wedged into the opening, at the thin thread of smoke rising from the pipe. Then he looked at Temperance with an expression that had nothing welcoming in it. "Ashford girl," he said. She held a length of split wood in her hands and did not set it down. He told her that this land was still claimed under the Timber and Stone Act, that squatters had no legal standing here, and that he could have the sheriff out within 2 days to drag her back to Visalia where she belonged. Then he told her what he really wanted. Her uncle, he said, had borrowed $14 from him in gambling debts and had run off before paying. The debt did not die with his departure. Someone had to settle it. He looked at her the way he had looked at the Sequoia, like something that might have a use he had not fully identified yet. She could work it off at the lumber camp, he said, cooking and cleaning and whatever else needed doing. Temperance felt her hands tighten on the wood. She did not raise it. She held it at her side and looked directly at Gilmore Merriweather and kept her voice as level as she could make it. "My uncle's debts are not mine," she said. "I did not borrow from you. I did not gamble. I owe you nothing. And if you try to collect from me the way you are suggesting, I will tell the sheriff exactly what kind of work you offered a 17-year-old girl on an empty piece of land with no witnesses." The clearing went very quiet. Merriweather took one step toward her. Temperance did not step back. 5 seconds passed in which neither of them moved, and the only sound was the wind in the high canopy above. Then Merriweather stepped back. "You will change your mind when the cold comes," he said. "When you are starving and freezing and begging for someone to help you, you will remember what I offered." He turned and walked back into the trees. Temperance watched him until the sound of his boots faded to nothing. Then she set the piece of wood down, carefully sat on the woodpile, and let herself shake for a little while before she went back to work. She did not sleep that night. Every sound in the forest became footsteps. Every groan of the Sequoia in the night wind became the sound of someone pressing against the door from outside. Merriweather had backed down, but the way he had done it, the calculation in his eyes when he retreated, told her it was not defeat she had seen. It was postponement. 2 days after Merriweather left the clearing, Sheriff Lemuel Yarborough rode up the mountain to find her. He was in his mid-40s, a lean and deliberate man who gave the impression of someone who thought carefully before doing anything, including speaking. He had received a report, he said, that someone was living illegally on land claimed under the Timber and Stone Act. He was not there to cause trouble. He was there because the law required him to be. He explained her situation plainly. The Timber and Stone Act allowed a company to hold a claim even when it was not actively operating. Until that claim was formally relinquished, no one else had the right to occupy the land. He gave her 1 week to leave or to find some legal basis for staying. Then he stopped talking and looked at the tree. He walked toward it slowly, looking at the door at the pipe angled up through 2 feet of bark, at the woodpile already stacked 4 feet high against the base of the trunk. He pressed his hand against the bark the way Temperance had done when she first found the hollow. He looked at the door construction, the lashed planks, and the packed mud seams. He turned back to Temperance. "You built all of this by yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he would return in 1 week, and he rode back down the mountain without another word. The look on his face as he had stood before the door was not pity. It was not contempt. It was something Temperance did not have a name for, yet something that sat between recognition and uncertainty. She did not know what he would do when he came back. She did not know whether that look meant anything at all. What she knew was this: she had 1 week to find a legal reason to stay. 1 week, $1.70 in a name that opened no doors. She went inside the hollow tree, built up the fire, and began to think. 6 days after Sheriff Yarborough rode down the mountain, Temperance walked into Hammond and asked to buy paper and a pen on credit. The storekeeper looked at her for a long moment, then sold her 2 sheets and the use of his inkwell for 3 cents. She did not have writing the amount in his ledger against her name. She sat at the corner of his counter and wrote a letter to the Tulare County Land Office, asking a single question: whether the Smith Comstock Lumber Company had renewed its timber claim on the land east of Hammond following the closure of their mill operation 2 years prior. She did not know if anyone would answer. She did not know if she was asking the right question. She only knew that Meriwether had spoken about the Timber and Stone Act with the confidence of a man who believed nobody would think to check his facts, and that confidence itself was a thing worth testing. She mailed the letter and walked back up the mountain and went to work. There were 4 days left in the week Yarborough had given her. On the morning of the 5th day, Yarborough returned. He came alone, riding the same horse, wearing the same expression he always wore, which was the expression of a man who had learned not to show what he was thinking until he had finished thinking it. He dismounted at the edge of the clearing and reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it out to Temperance. The land office had been faster than she expected. Or perhaps Yarborough had gone himself and asked the same question she had thought to ask, because the answer had come back before her letter could have arrived in any county seat. Either way, the paper said the same thing she had hoped it might say. Smith Comstock had not renewed their claim. The filing had lapsed 18 months after the mill closed, when the company defaulted on the annual maintenance fees. The land had reverted to federal ownership. It was unappropriated public land now, which meant Gilmore Meriwether had no more legal standing on it than Temperance did, which also meant Temperance had no legal standing either. Yarborough explained it plainly. She could file a preemption claim, which would give her the right to occupy and eventually purchase the land, but the filing required $1.25 in fees and the signature of a witness who could attest to her presence and her improvements. If approved, she would have 90 days of protected occupancy while the claim was processed. She had $1.70. The fee was manageable. The witness was the problem. She walked 3 miles up the mountain to the Sequoia colony the following morning. Denton Dunstan was splitting wood behind the common kitchen when she came through the tree line. He straightened and set down his axe and waited for her to say what she had come to say. She told him what she needed: a signature, a witness who could confirm she had been living at the hollow Sequoia, that she had built the shelter herself, that the improvements were real. Dunstan did not answer immediately. He picked up his axe and turned it over in his hands, which was not something a man did when he had already decided. The colony's principles, he explained, opposed individual land ownership as a concept. If he signed a document supporting a private land claim, some members would argue he had compromised those principles. The colony had enough internal disputes already without him adding another. Temperance listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she said, "I am not asking you to give me the land. I am asking you to confirm that I exist on it, that I was here, that I built what I built with my own hands. You have seen it yourself." Dunstan looked at her. She said, "You let me take those planks. You did not stop me. You watched me drag them across the clearing, and you stood there and decided not to interfere. And I think you made that decision because some part of you believed that what I was doing is worth not interfering with. All I am asking now is for you to say out loud what you already decided with your silence." The axe turned over once more in his hands. Then Dunstan set it against the chopping block and said he would sign. He rode down to Hammond with her and signed the paper in front of Yarborough, who witnessed it and affixed his seal and said he would file it himself when he passed through the county seat the following week. Temperance paid $1.25 from her remaining money. She had 45 cents left. As Dunstan remounted his horse outside the store, he said something she did not expect. "My wife Agnes heard about you," he said. "She has opinions about the matter." "What kind of opinions?" He gathered his reins. "The kind that will cause her to come up here herself if she decides you need something." He paused. "I would advise you to not need anything if you can manage it." He rode back up the mountain without further explanation, and Temperance was left standing in the street with 45 cents a pending land claim and the knowledge that somewhere in the Sequoia colony there was a woman she had never met, who was apparently watching her situation with more attention than she had realized. She filed the rest of the money away in the tin she kept bolted to the floor of the hollow tree and went back to cutting wood. The problem with the firewood was not the cutting. Temperance had taught herself to split deadfall with a rock wedge and a length of iron bar she had found rusting in the grass near the abandoned mill. The problem was the arithmetic. Dunstan had estimated a cord of wood per month for a space the size of the hollow tree. 6 months of Sierra winter meant 6 cords minimum. She had 3 cords stacked against the Sequoia by the end of October, each one representing dozens of hours of work, and she was already burning a quarter cord every 10 days just to stay warm through the October nights. She rose before the sun every morning and worked until she could not see her hands in front of her. The deadfall near the tree had been cleared weeks ago. She was now ranging a half-mile in either direction, dragging sections of fallen trunk back to the clearing, splitting them with the wedge, stacking the pieces in crisscrossed rows to season. Her hands had cracked and split in the dry autumn air until the knuckles bled when she bent her fingers. She had lost 10 pounds since leaving Visalia, maybe more. The meals she allowed herself were small rationed against the possibility of a longer winter than expected, and her body had begun to consume itself with the work. She was adding to the woodpile on a cold afternoon in the second week of October when she noticed that a section of the eastern stack had come down, not blown down. The logs had been stacked in the crisscross pattern she had learned kept them from rolling a pattern that did not fail on its own. The bottom logs had been pulled forward and the upper courses had followed. She stood at the edge of the mess and looked at it for a long moment, then looked at the ground around it. The boot prints in the soft dirt at the edge of the clearing were recent, deep heel marks wide to the stride of a large man. She followed them to the tree line where they stopped and turned back without going further. She thought about what Meriwether had said when he left, that the cold would change her mind, that when she was starving and freezing, she would remember what he had offered. This was not the cold. This was Meriwether sending her a message in a language that left no legal evidence, telling her that the land office paper meant nothing to him and that his capacity to make her life difficult had not ended when Yarborough took his filing fee. She went to Hammond the next morning and found Yarborough at his office. She told him about the boot prints. She told him about the stacked wood pulled down. She told him she had no witness and no direct evidence, and she was not asking him to arrest anyone. She was asking him to know. Yarborough listened without moving. When she finished, he looked at her steadily and said, "If Meriwether or anyone acting for him lays a hand on you or damages your property in front of a witness, I will be there. Without a witness, the law requires more than I can give you based on boot prints. But I am telling you plainly that I know what I know, and Meriwether knows that I know it. That is not nothing. It was not enough either, but it was what the law could offer, and Temperance had learned not to spend energy hating the limits of things she could not change. She thanked him and went back up the mountain. She restacked the wood that afternoon, and she stacked it differently this time, adding a top course that would take longer to pull down and would leave more obvious evidence of interference if it came down wrong again. Then she went back to cutting. The first frost arrived on the 15th of October. Temperance woke to ice crystals on the pine boughs outside the tree and a crust of white on the woodpile. Inside the hollow, the temperature had held at 41 degrees through the night, with the stove banked low. The bark was working. She had known it would work, had reasoned it through and proved it in the test nights of late September. But knowing and experiencing were different things. She stood in the doorway in the early morning cold and felt the warmth pressing against her back from inside the tree, and something loosened slightly in her chest that had been pulled tight since July. November arrived with wind. The first major storm came through on the 8th, 3 weeks before any of the Hammond old-timers had predicted. Temperance heard it building in the early afternoon, a low vibration in the air that she felt before she heard a frequency too deep for casual wind. She loaded the stove with the largest pieces she had and wedged the door shut and got onto her bed and pulled the blankets over her and waited. The noise when it arrived was extraordinary. Branches broke somewhere in the forest with sounds like rifle shots. Whole trees went down, each one hitting the earth with a concussion she felt through the floor. The Sequoia moved. She felt it through her spine, a slow lateral shift, a flex, and return that happened in the space of seconds and left the tree standing exactly where it had been. The roots held. The trunk held. The walls around her groaned once and went quiet. She stayed in the hollow for 3 hours. When the wind dropped and she pushed the door open, the clearing looked like something had swept through it in a rage. A large pine had fallen directly across the area where she had stored 3/4 of a cord of split wood, crushing and scattering it across 20 feet of forest floor. Two other trees had come down at the edges of the clearing. Branches were everywhere. She spent 4 days recovering what she could. A quarter cord, perhaps slightly less. The rest was buried under the fallen trunk or scattered too far to retrieve before dark. The carefully stacked wood she had spent weeks accumulating was reduced in 3 hours of wind to 2 3/4 cords remaining. 3 weeks until hard winter. She sat beside what was left of the woodpile as the sun went down behind the ridge, and for the first time since she had found the hollow tree, she let herself consider seriously whether she had made a mistake. Not about the tree. The tree had done everything she had predicted and more. But Talmadge had told her she would need 6 cords. She had believed him. She had worked toward that number with everything she had. And the mountain had taken 1.5 cords in an afternoon, and she still had 5 months of cold ahead of her. The mathematics had never worked. She had known that from the beginning. She had simply chosen to keep moving anyway because moving was the only direction available to her. Now she sat in the dark and felt the full weight of that choice pressing down. Then she heard hooves on the mountain trail. She stood up and moved to the side of the doorway, putting the tree between herself and the approach the way she had learned to position herself whenever she heard something coming, before she could see what it was. She had a length of wood in her hand before she fully decided to pick it up. But it was not Merriweather. Denton Dunstan came into the clearing, leading a mule loaded with split firewood, a full cord bundled and stacked across the animal's back. He tied the mule to a branch and began unloading without ceremony or preamble. Temperance stood at the edge of the clearing and watched him work. She asked what this was. "The colony cut more than it needed for the common kitchen this season," he said. "We have surplus." He set down an armload and went back for another. She said she could not pay him. He said he had not asked her to. She stood there for a moment longer. Then she asked the question she actually wanted to ask, which was why. Not why he had surplus, but why he had brought it to her. Dunstan paused with a length of wood in each hand. He said that he had told his wife about her, about the girl who was building what he had called a coffin in a dead tree. Agnes had listened to the whole account and then told him that if he did not bring something useful up that mountain, she would come herself and drag the girl back to the colony by force if necessary. "I told Agnes you refused to come to the colony," Dunstan said. "What did she say to that?" He put the wood down. "She said that any woman who could figure out what you figured out about those trees and then execute it alone with $4 and a borrowed drill was not a woman who needed to be rescued. She said you needed to be equipped." Temperance had no response to that. She picked up an armload of wood and started stacking it against the tree alongside him. They worked in silence until the mule was unloaded. When they finished, Temperance had 3 3/4 cords against the Sequoia, still short of 6, still not enough by Dunstan's own estimate, but closer. He studied the door construction, the pipe angled out of the bark, the stacked boughs visible through the gap. He said she had done better work than he expected. Then he said it might still not be enough. She said she knew. He untied the mule and started back down the trail. He said she could repay him in spring if she made it that far. He said it without confidence, but without apology either, and that combination was the closest thing to honest encouragement she had received from anyone since leaving Visalia. She watched him go until the trees swallowed the sound of hooves, and then she went back to work. December came and brought with it the first real test of what she had built. On the 23rd, 2 feet of snow fell in a single night, and Temperance woke to a world so silent it seemed the mountain had stopped breathing. She pushed the door open and stood in the entrance to the hollow, looking out at the Sequoia rising from the white drifts, its bark dusted with ice crystals that caught the thin winter light. Inside, the temperature had held at 38 degrees on a night when the outside air had dropped below 20. She measured her firewood consumption against her remaining supply. A quarter cord per week, not the cord per month Dunstan had predicted. The small enclosed space, the thick insulating bark, the coals she learned to bank at night, so they held heat for hours without active burning, all of it added up to arithmetic that was finally working in her favor. If the winter followed its normal pattern, she would reach spring with wood to spare. The old-timers in Hammond were not expecting a normal winter. She heard the talk each time she walked down for supplies. Men who had lived in the Sierra foothills for 30 and 40 years, men who watched the sky and the snowpack and the movement of storms the way their grandfathers had watched the weather before anyone had instruments to measure it. They spoke about what was forming over Alaska in the way men speak about something they can see coming and cannot stop. A stall, they called it. A system that would stop moving and simply sit over the mountains and deliver everything it had until there was nothing left to deliver. One man said he had seen something like it once before in 1867, and that winter people had measured snow in feet the way ordinary winters measured it in inches. Temperance added wood to the inside store. She melted snow in the clay pots she kept near the stove and stored the water. She cut her daily food consumption, further stretching her acorn flour and dried rabbit meat toward a horizon she could not see the end of. On the 8th of February, 2 days before everything changed, Gilmore Merriweather came back to the clearing. He did not come alone this time. He brought Cal Rathbone, a man who worked at the remnants of the mill camp, broad through the shoulders with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that his size communicated threats without any additional effort on his part. They came up the trail in the early afternoon and stopped at the edge of the clearing, and Merriweather stood there looking at the Sequoia the way he might look at a lock he had decided to open. He told Temperance that her preemption claim had been rejected. The county land office, it turned out, did not process claims filed by individuals under the age of 21 without a legal guardian's countersignature. She was 17. The paperwork was void. He had known this when the claim was filed. He had let her believe she had protection for 2 months, and now he had come back to collect on the bet he had made with himself that winter would do enough damage to her confidence that she would be ready to accept what he offered. Temperance looked at him. She looked at Rathbone. She looked at the distance between herself and the tree line in 3 directions. The clearing was empty. The nearest settlement was 3 miles away. She had no witnesses and no legal claim, and a man in front of her who had been patient for 4 months and had now decided the patience was finished. She said, "Sheriff Yarborough has a copy of my filing. He knows I am here. If I disappear before this storm comes through, he will ask why, and then he will ask you." The clearing went quiet the way it had gone quiet in October. Rathbone looked at Merriweather. Merriweather looked at Temperance, and she held that look without moving, without adjusting her expression, without giving him any signal that she was calculating anything at all. Merriweather took a step back. He said the storm would do what he had been waiting for it to do. Then he turned and walked out of the clearing with Rathbone behind him, and the sound of their boots in the frozen ground grew smaller and then disappeared. Temperance stood alone in the clearing and let the silence settle around her. The sky to the west had taken on a color she had not seen before, not the orange and red of ordinary sunset, not the gray-white of coming snow, but a deep blue-violet that seemed to have no light source, as though the color itself was generating a kind of darkness. The air had an edge to it that was not simply cold. It was pressure. It was the feeling of something immense preparing to move. She had 36 hours, maybe less. She went inside and started loading the stove and did not stop working until she had done everything she could think of to do. She was still awake at midnight when the cough began. It started as a tickle at the back of her throat, the kind that might mean nothing. She drank water, banked the fire higher, pulled the blankets tight, and told herself it was the dry air from the stove, the cold she had been working in for weeks, the normal friction of a body that had been pushed hard all autumn. She had been coughing since January in small ways, a morning roughness that cleared after an hour and nothing more. This was different. By 2 in the morning, it had moved into her chest and settled there with a weight she could not cough clear. By dawn, she was running a fever, not the gentle warmth of mild illness, but the kind that made the edges of things shimmer and took the reliability out of her own hands. She could barely keep the fire. On the 10th of February, the sky outside her door was clear and pale and cold. No storm. Nothing to see in any direction that would tell someone what was coming. Temperance lay on her bed of pine boughs beneath every blanket she owned and drifted in and out of a sleep that gave her no rest. She was sick, and she was cold, and she was alone, and somewhere 200 miles to the north, the worst blizzard in Sierra Nevada history was completing its turn south toward the mountains. She did not know that. She only knew the fever and the cold, and the sound of wind beginning very far away, moving through the trees like a slow wave. On the morning of February 11th, at 12 minutes past noon, the sky turned black. The wind did not build gradually, it arrived. One moment the air was still, and the sky above the Sequoia was that deep violet that had no name, and the next moment the forest was screaming. Not the long, sustained howl of an ordinary Sierra storm, but something that hit the tree line all at once, a wall of sound and force that bent the smaller trees flat and sent them whipping back like struck matches. Temperance felt the sequoia move beneath her before she heard the full force of it, a deep lateral shift in the floor, the roots pulling against the frozen earth, the massive trunk absorbing a load of wind that would have snapped anything smaller in the first 10 seconds. She had loaded the stove an hour before. She had the blankets around her shoulders. She had done everything she could think to do. She pulled the blankets over her head and waited. The first hour was the loudest thing she had ever survived. Trees were going down in the forest around her, each one making a sound on impact like a cannon fired into wet ground, a percussive thud she felt in her back teeth. The sequoia swayed in a rhythm she began to recognize as the storm's pulse, a lean and a return, a lean and a return, the massive root system working against the earth like a hand pressing against a wall. The walls groaned once every few minutes, a sound that rose from somewhere deep in the wood and moved upward through the trunk and dispersed into the canopy she could not see. The roots below her had held through fires and floods and the slow weight of centuries. She told herself to trust them now. By the sixth hour, evening had come and gone without announcement. The light through the gaps in the door planks had never brightened beyond a gray half-dark, and now it was simply dark day and night made identical by the weight of snow and cloud pressing down on the world. The temperature inside the hollow had dropped to 40 degrees. Temperance crawled from the bed to the stove, added 2 logs, blew on the coals until the flames took and crawled back. The effort left her gasping. The fever had not broken. If anything, it had climbed, and the sweat that should have cooled her was doing the opposite, soaking through her clothes and chilling against her skin and leaving her shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature in the tree. She drank from the clay pot she had filled before the storm. She ate nothing. The thought of food turned her stomach. She lay back on the boughs and listened to the wind and tried to remember the last time she had felt well, and the memory was so far back it felt like something that had happened to a different person. At midnight, she woke to cold that was no longer merely uncomfortable. It was insistent. It was the kind of cold that wanted something from her. The stove had burned down to almost nothing. A handful of orange coals glowing in the dark, and the temperature in the hollow had fallen to 38 degrees. She knew this not from any instrument, but from the particular quality of the air on her face when she pulled the blanket back. She had spent enough nights in this tree to know its temperatures the way a person knows the rooms of a house they have lived in for years. She tried to sit up, her arms buckled. She lay on her back for a moment, looking up at the blackened ceiling of the hollow, the pale grain of the surviving wood visible even in the near darkness. Then she rolled onto her side, then onto her hands and knees. The floor was hard and cold through the pine boughs, and she could feel every root beneath them pressing up into her palms. She began to crawl, 6 feet to the woodpile. She covered it in what felt like 10 minutes, one hand forward, then one knee, then the other hand, pausing twice when the darkness at the edges of her vision moved in too close, and she had to stop and breathe through it. She reached the stack and got her hands around a log. Missed the stove door the first time, missed it again. On the third attempt, the door swung open and she got the log inside, and then another, and then a handful of the kindling she kept dry in a cloth beside the stack. She blew on the coals. The effort took everything she had. White light bloomed at the edges of her vision, and her lungs burned, and she thought for one clear-headed moment that this might be it, that the blowing might be the last useful thing her body managed tonight. Then the kindling caught. The small bright tongue of flame found the larger logs and moved across them, and heat began to radiate outward from the open door. And Temperance lay down on the floor of the hollow tree with her cheek against the charred wood and let the warmth reach her face. She was alive. The fire was burning. The tree was standing. She did not have the strength to return to the bed. She pulled a blanket from it by reaching up and dragging it down, wrapped it around herself on the floor, and lay there with her back to the stove and her face turned toward the barred door. Outside, the wind had not paused. It had not lessened. It screamed on through the night with the patience of something that had no deadline and no fatigue, and the sequoia swayed in its long, slow rhythm, and the roots held and the bark held, and Temperance Ashford lay on the floor of a hollow tree at the top of the world and was against every reasonable expectation still breathing. By the 18th hour, dawn had come in theory somewhere above the cloud cover. Though nothing in the hollow changed to mark it, what changed was Temperance herself. She woke on the floor drenched, not the slow seeping dampness of cold sweat, but a thorough soaking blankets wet through hair, plastered flat, the feeling of having been submerged and retrieved. She lay still for a moment cataloging what she felt. Then she understood. The fever had broken. She sat up. Her arms held her. She moved them experimentally, then her legs, then turned her head without the world spinning underneath her. The pain was still there, the ache in every joint, the rawness deep in her chest, but the thing behind the pain was different now. The sickness was moving out instead of in. Her body had spent the night fighting and had won. She pushed the door. It did not open. She pushed harder, putting her shoulder into it, and the door moved perhaps an inch and stopped. Snow had piled against the outside in the night, compressing against the planks, and what had been a simple interior latch was now a wall of consolidated white, holding the door shut from outside. She was sealed in. She stood in the entrance for a moment and felt the first cold brush of what might have become panic, then let it pass. The temperature inside the hollow had stabilized at 40 degrees despite the storm outside. She had firewood. She had water. She was not in danger of dying in the next few hours, which was the only timeline that mattered. She pushed against the door one more time, a steady pressure rather than a shove, and felt it give another inch and stop. She went back to the stove and ate, dried acorns, 4 of them, chewing slowly and deliberately, forcing her stomach to accept them. Then dried rabbit, a small piece, then water from the clay pot. Then she added wood to the fire, wrapped herself in the least wet of the blankets, and sat on the boughs and listened. The wind had changed, not stopped, but changed. The screaming had dropped by a register, the quality of the sound shifting from the high, desperate pitch of maximum force to something lower and more deliberate. The pauses between gusts were longer. The Sequoia still swayed, but the sway was smaller. Whatever the storm was, it was spending itself. She sat and listened to it spend itself and thought about things she had not let herself think about during the months of working and planning and surviving. She thought about Raymond Grantham, the old widower from the colony who Dunstan had mentioned was planning to check on an outlying family when the storm allowed a lull. She thought about Agnes Colwood, who had sent her husband up the mountain with firewood based on nothing more than the account of a stranger's stubbornness. She thought about Yarborough, who had looked at her door and her pipe and her woodpile and said not one word of encouragement, but had filed her paperwork himself and told her plainly what he knew and what he could do within the limits of what the law allowed. None of them had saved her. She understood that clearly. What they had done was something quieter than saving. They had declined to make things harder. They had cleared a space around her and let her save herself, which was a different thing entirely, and which she suspected might be the only kind of saving that actually held. She pushed the door again. This time it moved 6 inches before catching on a mass of snow. She worked it back and forth, widening the gap, pushing the snow outward by degrees until she had created a channel just wide enough to force her shoulders through. Then she pushed herself into the channel and dug with her bare hands until her fingers hit open air on the other side. The silence when she emerged was enormous. She stood in a tunnel of her own, making the snow level with her chin at the opening, and looked out at a world she did not recognize. The trees were gone. The clearing was gone. Everything below the height of the snow surface was buried, the rocks and the stumps and the split rail fencing she had built around the woodpile, all of it erased. What remained above the white was a forest reduced to its tallest components, the upper sections of the pines and cedars and firs, and rising above all of them, unmistakable and unchanged, the cinnamon red pillar of the Sequoia. It stood exactly as it had stood through 2,000 years of Sierra storms. Smoke still drifted from the pipe she had cut through 18 inches of bark. Not a crack in the outer shell, not a split in the wood. While the storm had dismantled the world around it, the tree had simply waited. Temperance pulled herself out of the tunnel and stood in the snow up to her chest and looked at the Sequoia for a long time without moving. Then she looked at the rest of the clearing. A pine had come down across the area where her outer woodpile had stood, its root ball torn from the frozen earth, and rising now like a dark wall 10 feet high. An oak had sheared off 20 feet up, the broken crown buried somewhere in the drifts. Smaller trees lay everywhere, their trunks cracked and split, their branches stripped. Only the Sequoia was unmarked. She went back inside and rebuilt the fire and sat on the boughs and let the warmth return to her fingers and she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since July. Not triumph, not relief, or not only relief, something older and simpler than either. The knowledge that she had been right, that the reasoning had held, that the tree had done what she had believed it would do in the worst conditions she could have been asked to prove it under. And the result was that she was sitting alive in a warm hollow on the morning after the worst blizzard in the recorded history of the Sierra Nevada, while the storm that had killed buildings and collapsed roofs and taken at least one good man's life walked away to the south without having touched her. She was 17 years old. She had $4 when she started. She had built this with her own hands. She sat with her that for a long time before she was ready to go find out what the storm had done to everyone else. 9 days passed before the snow settled enough to walk down to Hammond. 9 days of digging out the entrance tunnel each morning, gathering fallen wood from the surface of the drifts, letting it dry near the stove before burning it, eating her remaining stores in careful portions, and boiling snow for water. The fever did not return. The cough loosened day by day until it was producing results rather than simply pain. And by the 5th day, she could stand it outside the hollow for an hour without needing to rest afterward. On the 20th of February, she followed the path that others had already beaten through the drifts and walked down to Hammond for the first time since the storm began. The town looked like it had been struck by something with a grudge. The general store had lost its roof on the second night, the entire structure collapsing inward under a snow load it had never been built to support. Anselm Ingram, the owner, had been inside taking inventory when it came down. His neighbors had heard his voice from somewhere underneath the wreckage and dug for 6 hours with shovels and their bare hands through the blizzard, working in shifts, pulling debris out by lantern light until they reached him before dawn. He was alive. He would not walk again. The doctor, an Army-trained man who had no formal credentials but a great deal of experience with what human bodies could and could not withstand, had done what he could in conditions that demanded improvisation. 3 other buildings had collapsed. The church had survived structurally, but its windows had blown in on the second night, and the pews were still buried under drifts that the congregation was only beginning to clear. It was Denton Dunstan who told her about Raymond Grantham. He found her near the remains of the general store, and his face was the face of a man who had been carrying something heavy for 9 days and had not yet found anywhere to put it down. He told her about the second day of the storm, the brief lull in the afternoon when the wind dropped for an hour, and the colony's doctor had prepared medicine for a child in an outlying cabin whose fever had been climbing for a week. Grantham had been the one who volunteered. He was 72 years old, a widower from San Francisco who had joined the colony 5 years earlier because he believed in the cooperative dream and wanted to spend his final years among people who shared his ideals. He tended the colony's garden and kept the accounts because the heavier work had passed beyond him. He knew the route to the outlying cabin, less than a quarter mile. They found him 3 days after the storm, when the snow was settled enough to search. 100 yards from the main settlement, not 50 feet from the path he had walked 100 times before. The tracks in the frozen surface told the story clearly. He had become disoriented in the whiteout within minutes of leaving the settlement. He had walked in expanding circles, each loop carrying him slightly further from where he needed to be. He had died facing the wrong direction, reaching toward a cabin that was behind him. He had the medicine in his coat pocket. Agnes Callwood was standing behind her husband when he finished telling it, and she did not look up from the ground while he spoke. When he fell silent, she finally raised her eyes and looked at Temperance directly. And it was the first time the two women had actually seen each other, though Agnes had known about Temperance for months. She was in her mid-40s, a compact and self-contained woman, with the particular quality of someone who formed opinions quickly and revised them only when the evidence was overwhelming. She said, "How did you get through it?" Temperance said the tree. Agnes looked at her for a moment. She had spent months building a picture of this girl from her husband's accounts. The girl building a coffin in a dead tree. The girl who refused to come to the colony. The girl who sent back the message that she needed to be equipped rather than rescued. Now the picture and the person were the same, and Agnes nodded once, the kind of nod that means I understand, and also means I needed to hear that, and went back inside the colony building without another word. Temperance watched her go and felt something pass between them that did not require elaboration. Pemberton Talmadge came 3 days later. Temperance was sitting outside the door of the Sequoia in the thin February sunlight, mending a tear in her coat sleeve with a needle she had borrowed in the fall and never returned. She heard the horse before she saw it, one set of hooves moving slowly through the packed snow on the trail, and she looked up to see Talmadge riding into the clearing alone. He dismounted and stood in the snow and looked at the sequoia. He did not speak immediately. He walked toward the tree, the way a man walks towards something he needs to examine honestly, without the comfort of a conclusion already prepared. He stopped in front of the door and looked at the pipe angled through the bark and the packed mud seal around it, weathered now, after a winter of freeze and thaw, but still holding. He put his hand against the outer bark. Then he knocked on it with his knuckle, a single short rap, and listened to the sound it made. He turned around. "I heard you made it," he said. "I made it. I heard about Grantham. I heard about Ingram. I heard that too." Talmadge looked back at the tree once more. He was a man who had built his life on the premise that experience was the most reliable teacher available, and that a man who had ranched these mountains for 23 years had accumulated enough of it to know what was possible and what was not. He had looked at Temperance in Three Rivers in July and had told her, based on that experience, exactly what would happen to her. He had not been trying to discourage her. He had been telling her the truth as he understood it. He had been wrong. "I told you they would find your bones in spring," he said. Temperance said nothing. He looked at her steadily. He was not a humble man. Humility was not a virtue the mountains cultivated in the men who stayed on them. But what was in his face now was something that lay close to it, a quality of genuine reckoning that she had not seen there before. "I have been ranching here for 23 years, he said. "I have seen every kind of winter this range can produce. I have never seen a structure come through a storm like that one without damage. Not a cabin, not a barn, not a building of any description. Half the town is broken. A man died walking 100 yards. But this tree did not move." He paused. "You figured out something I did not know was possible." He turned and walked to his horse and mounted and rode back down the trail without another word. The following morning he came back. He brought a quarter quart of split wood, 2 pounds of bacon wrapped in cloth, and a sack of flour. He set them down outside the door of the hollow and called her name until she appeared. He did not call it charity. He called it payment for a lesson. He said it in the flat and practical tone of a man settling a debt he acknowledged, and then he rode away again. And that was the entirety of Pemberton Talmadge's apology. It was enough. It was from a man like that more than enough. Word moved through the foothills the way news always moved in those places, carried by whoever was traveling and stopping at whatever fire had people around it. Within a week, Dunstan was at the hollow with a notebook and a length of measuring cord, spending an hour inside the tree, pressing his palms against the walls, holding his thermometer at different heights, asking Temperance questions she answered as precisely as she could. How much wood per week? What was the coldest temperature she had recorded inside? Did the tree sway in the heavy winds? She told him everything she knew. He took notes on all of it without commenting. When he stood to leave, he said only that the colony had already identified 3 standing dead sequoias in the giant forest suitable for the same purpose. They were planning to develop the largest one as an emergency shelter and supply cache. He said they should have thought of it years ago. Temperance said nothing about that. What she thought was that the colony had 300 people and 30 years of combined mountain experience, and none of them had looked at a hollow tree and seen what she had seen, and the difference between them was not intelligence or experience, but necessity. Necessity had a way of showing you things that comfort kept hidden. 3 families from the colony visited over the following week. They came with questions and measuring tools, and the focused attention of people who had lost something they valued and were not willing to lose it again. Temperance walked each of them through the hollow, showed them the stove placement and the floor insulation, and the way the door had been fitted and sealed. She charged nothing. She claimed nothing. The knowledge was not hers to own. It had come from the forest and from her mother's quilts and from the particular pressure of having no other option, and it was available to anyone willing to stand inside a hollow tree and think. Hilo Tharp heard about her in early March. He was 70 years old and had been spending his summers inside a fallen sequoia log at a place called Log Meadow since 1861, when he had fitted a door and a window and a small chimney into the fire-hollowed interior and made of it a seasonal cabin that John Muir had visited and written about with admiration. Tharp had been living proof for 30 years that the sequoia could house a human being, and when the account of Temperance's winter reached him, he reportedly laughed loud enough to be heard from the next room. He sent her a gift through Dunstan, a jar of honey from his own bees, golden and dense, and a piece of advice written in a carpenter's careful hand on a scrap of butcher paper. The advice said standing trees do not last. Fallen ones do. Come next year, move into a log. Temperance set the jar on the shelf she had cut into the inner wall of the hollow at eye level, where she would see it every morning. She did not open it. It was not meant to be eaten. It was meant to be proof of something she needed confirmed, that she was not the first person to read what the forest was offering, and that what she had done was not madness, but recognition. The same recognition that had kept an old rancher comfortable in a log for 30 years, while every conventional structure around him aged and leaked and let in the cold. She was not crazy. She had simply been desperate enough to listen. George Stewart arrived from Visalia in the second week of April when the snow had dropped enough that the lower trails were passable. He was the editor of the Visalia Delta, a man who would spend the next decade of his life fighting for the preservation of the giant forest from the logging companies that wanted to cut it down. He had heard about the Sequoia shelters from the colony and had ridden up to see them for himself. He spent 2 hours at Temperance's tree, walking around it, examining the modifications, asking about the winter in the methodical way of a journalist organizing facts into an argument. He asked if he could write about her specifically by name. She said no. He asked why. She thought about how to explain it and finally said the tree did the work. I just moved in. Write about the tree. Stewart wrote about the Sequoia shelters in the Delta 3 weeks later. He described the hollow trees of the giant forest as structures that had survived every test the mountain could produce, that had outlasted every human construction in their vicinity, and that demonstrated something about the difference between building against nature and building with it. He did not mention Temperance's name. He mentioned the principle she had discovered and the winter that had proven it, and left it at that. It was enough, more than enough. In May, when the high passes cleared and the roads opened, Temperance walked down from the mountain to Visalia. She carried everything she owned in a pack that weighed less than 30 pounds. Her hands were calloused and her face was weathered and her body was lean, with the kind of muscle that comes from months of real labor, and the women who had crossed the street to avoid her when she left in July looked at her differently now, which was not the same as looking at her warmly, but was at least the acknowledgement that she had become something they had not predicted. She found work at a boarding house on the north side of town, cooking and cleaning for a woman who asked no questions about where she had spent the winter and paid fairly for what she received. Temperance worked through the summer and saved what she earned and did not talk much about the hollow tree to anyone who had not already heard about it, which in Tulare County by that point was no one. Gilmore Merriweather had left the county by April. His mill camp had collapsed in the storm, 2 bunkhouses down, equipment buried 3 men injured, and Merriweather had been 40 miles away in a hotel room in Visalia when it happened. The men who had worked for him did not forget that. By the time the snow cleared and the damage could be assessed, the practical authority he had carried in the foothills for years had evaporated. He sold what remained of the equipment, claimed to a buyer from Fresno, and relocated to a logging operation in Oregon. Temperance passed him once on the road between Hammond and the county seat in the first week of March before he left. He looked through her as though she were not there. She returned the courtesy and walked on. Lemuel Yarborough came to see her one last time in late March before the roads fully opened. He brought a document from the county land office that she had not expected. Her preemption claim had been re-examined at his request by a senior land officer who had ruled that the original rejection based on age in the absence of a guardian had applied a provision intended for minors seeking to purchase land commercially, not for individuals in demonstrated need seeking survival occupancy. The rejection was overturned. The claim was reinstated, and she had 4 years before she would need to convert it to a purchase filing, which she could do at 21. Yarborough handed her the paper and watched her read it. She looked up. He said, "You survived the winter. I expect you will survive the paperwork." That was the whole of it. He tipped his hat and rode south, and she stood in the melting snow watching him go and felt a particular kind of gratitude that does not announce itself, the kind that settles quietly into the body alongside everything else a person carries and stays there. She married Randolph Osgood in the spring of 1893. He was a carpenter in Three Rivers, a quiet man who built good houses and asked few questions about the years before they met, and who had the particular virtue of understanding that the woman he had married had done something that required no embellishment from him and no explaining to anyone else. They moved into a proper house with proper walls, and Temperance learned gradually to sleep without listening for the sounds of wood under stress in the wind. But every spring when the trail up the mountain cleared, she made the walk, 6 miles from Three Rivers to the clearing in the giant forest, 6 miles on roads she knew every stone and root of. And she would sit outside the door of the hollow Sequoia for an hour, sometimes two in whatever weather April offered. She would look at the bark at the pipe she had cut and sealed with her own hands at the door she had built, from salvaged planks and bark strips in mud and pitch. And she would let herself remember what it had cost to make this thing and what it had given her in return. She stopped making the trip sometime in her early 70s when the climb became more than her legs could manage reliably. By then, the hollow had become a stopping point for people traveling through the giant forest, a curiosity that older settlers pointed out to their children and grandchildren as a place where something unlikely had happened. The stove was long gone, taken by time or scavengers or both. The pine boughs had rotted away. The door had weathered to a gray that matched the charred walls behind it. But the hollow itself was unchanged, the curved walls solid, the space inside still the same, 8 feet wide and 12 feet high, that Temperance had cleaned out with a flat stone in the autumn of 1889. Temperance Ashford Osgood died in the summer of 1947 at the age of 75. She was buried in the Three Rivers Cemetery 100 yards from the Sequoia River, 15 miles from the Sequoia that had kept her alive. The stone above her grave gave her name and her dates and nothing else, which was how she would have wanted it. The tree is still standing. It has stood through every winter since 1890, through storms that collapsed newer and better-built structures, through decades of snow and wind, and the slow passage of time that has claimed everything else from that winter except the tree itself. Anyone who visits the giant forest and knows where to look can find it a dead sequoia with a small door fitted into the bark. Weathered but unbroken, the hollow inside still curved and solid and dry. Pemberton Talmadge told a 17-year-old girl with $4 and no family that the mountains would kill her. He had 23 years of experience behind that prediction and every reason to believe it was true. He was right about almost everything. He was wrong about Temperance Ashford. She had $4, no family, and it needed shelter she could not build. So she moved into the shelter the forest had already made because she was desperate enough to look for it and honest enough to see it when she found it. The bark that had kept fire out for 1,000 years kept cold out for one winter. The roots that had held the tree through every storm before held it through the worst storm in the mountain's recorded memory. The tree did the work. She just moved in.